So there's a lot of evidence on the benefits of local food systems and why farmers want to supply more into them, but there's less up-to-date research into the makeup, the nuts and bolts of specific local and regional supply chains, be it the specific benefits, the specific needs, and in order to make the case for support and investment. So the purpose of this work we're going to be hearing from today from Sustain, Manchester Met University and the Soil Association was and is an attempt to map out those at a local level. So during this workshop, we're going to be exploring what these two pieces of work have found and what the outcomes are from them. There's also going to be a chance to ask questions after both of these talks. And the workshop will then break into a discussion session where we want to hear reflections from attendees as experts in the field, literally, and your local areas. We're then going to be wrapping up on how to take this work forward from the discussion that we've had. Before we start, I want to do a little housekeeping. So I'm going to ask you all to remain on mute until you're asked to unmute. There will be a chance to ask questions after the two presentations and also in the breakout group. So please use the yellow icon to raise your hand if you want to speak in these sections. I think there should be a function at the bottom in order to do that. Reactions, under reactions, if you click on more and reactions. As you'll see, we are recording this, and a recording and write-up is going to be shared in due course. Finally, I'd like to thank the Ashton Trust, now named the Aurora Trust, for funding this work. Before I hand over to Ruth from the Soil Association to say a few words about the history of their work in the space and the context, I wanted just to give a little bit of introduction to Sustain's work in this space. Now, I'm just going to try and share my screen, see if this works. Here we go. So I suppose just to give a little bit of a background, whilst today we're going to be really hearing about the middle bit, the supply and the infrastructure, I just wanted to give a bit of context, including some of our work around production, particularly led by my colleagues Vicky and James and Ario. So some of the recent work we've been doing on this, as well as loads and loads of work on policy and ALMS at a national level, is working around things like fringe farming. So working with a few cities around the UK to try to increase the amount of production and supply of food that is grown in the urban fringe. We've also done a survey, this was a couple of years back, with 500 farmers. This is the Beyond the Farm Gate report that you can see in front of you. And what was really, I think, telling about this research was it documented how much demand there is from farmers to diversify into supplying locally, to supplying through farmer-focused supply chains. So 56% of farmers wanted to supply into different markets beyond supermarkets, and a further 20% would consider that. 51% wanted to see more food hubs, box schemes, farmers markets, and 50% wanting to join or start a cooperative. And this was really, I think, a big, I mean, it's incredibly useful evidence, but it's also, I think, sort of really galvanized us to sort of do more work in this area. So we're going to be hearing later about the work we've done in the two counties, the tale from two counties, but alongside that we also did some work drawing on expertise throughout the sector, a joint report we did with the RSPB. This was partly to try to inform the national food strategy, to make sure there was more in there for local food. Be honest, didn't work. There wasn't much in there about local food, but what it did do is actually sort of bring together that evidence base and update it from lots of brilliant work that had been done historically by many people on this call, people like CPRE, but it brought it up to date to really make that case on why local food systems, farmer-focused short supply chains are important. And you'll see, I won't go through the stats on the side, but these are some of the findings that came out of that about the important impact that local supply chains can have in terms of economic benefits and environmental benefits, social benefits. I suppose just to look briefly, we're not going to be touching upon this much today, but just to look briefly at, I suppose, the other end of the supply chain and that work around demand, which has been one of the things that we've been doing a lot over the years and will indeed continue to do. So trying to make that agroecological food, trying to make local food more affordable. We're starting a new project called Bridging the Gap, which is trying to do just that. So we did a lot of work with groups working with lower income communities to try and improve access to healthy, affordable food. And equally, we do a lot of work with trying to improve supply of agroecological food. But we're trying to bring bridge the gap and actually make sure that more of that supply can go through to those projects. A lot of work around awareness to try to increase that demand. So whether that's our Real Bread campaign, which is working particularly to promote sort of small bakers and some of those sort of small supply chains through some of the sort of local grain networks, or whether it's things like the Jelly Deal, which is our as a flagship magazine for London, trying to create more demand for local and agroecological food in London, as well as many other things. And I suppose finally to kind of think about that sort of increasing access to local food. So something that we're planning next is to try to bring together the sector. This is something we'll be doing next year, to devise a local food retail growth plan. So how can we increase the demand for agroecological food and increase the production of it from that sort of demand end? So by increasing the amount of retail and the amount of local food that is going through independent retail. But that's just a bit of background in terms of sustained work in this space, to give a bit of context to what you're going to be hearing today. I'm going to hand over to Ruth now to give a little bit of background about Soil Association's work in this space.
Thank you very much, Ben. Hi, everybody. My name is Ruth Galpine, and I'm the Associate Director for Healthy and Sustainable Diets at the Soil Association. I'm also going to share a little bit of background into the research that we've commissioned and are sharing today, and a little overview of our work in this area as well. So bear with me a mo while I attempt to get my slides. Hopefully you can see these. Let me just put them into full screen mode. There we go. So Soil Association works on many fronts when it comes to localised supply chains, and we have done for a number of years. And because we work across the supply chain, from farmers and growers through to buyers, we're very interested in supply chain work, and in particular local supply chains, for the benefits they bring environmentally, social and economically as well. And in particular, a key area of focus for us is public sector procurement. Due to the opportunities of scale. You can see on here, estimated that 5.5% of UK food service turnover is in the public sector. The reach, at least a quarter of UK population consume at least one public sector meal a day. And also the ability to feed some of the most vulnerable in society, so our children through schools, and people who are elderly or unwell through the care sector and hospitals as well. And through our Food for Life Served Here catering scheme, we already have a mechanism for encouraging local food procurement. And we've seen significant impact from this scheme over the years, with public sector caterers including more and more local produce in their menus. And our teams work really hard with caterers to design menus that specifically support regional produce. So we're very interested in local food supply. And along with colleagues in the Dynamic Food Procurement National Advisory Board, of which we are a member, we wanted to explore some of the challenges and opportunities surrounding local supply into the public sector. And this research that we're going to be sharing with you today has exposed some of the barriers, but also crucially what the opportunities are, if we can all pull together and work collectively to address these. So this particular piece of research that we commissioned with Manchester Metropolitan University and funded by the Aurora Trust builds on previous research that we've done in this area, and in particular a Soil Association report 18 months ago, you can see here in the middle, the shortening supply chains piece, that recommended crucially investment is needed to facilitate the mapping and coordination of local producers in areas where there is willingness from the public sector in terms of procurement. And so this piece of research today has built on that to actually map regional supply and public sector demand. And we hope that the findings can be used to show the art of the possible and basically a proof of concept for what can be achieved. So today, Dr. Adrian Morley, who conducted the research, is going to be sharing the findings and recommendations. And afterwards, both reports will be shared with you alongside a write-up of today's discussion. I've just popped on here my contact details. If there's anything further that you would love to discuss or get involved with, or work perhaps with us on, please do drop me a line. You can see my contact details there. I'm going to stop sharing this one and attempt to share now our Jamboard, which is going to be an interactive screen that we'll be using, bear with me a second, here we go, to document discussion points as we're going along through the discussion later on in the agenda. I don't know if you're all familiar with Google Jamboard. It's quite straightforward. We'll pop the link in the chat in a second. You don't need to log in. Essentially, you click on the link and you'll hopefully see this screen. We've got 5 discussion topics. If you scroll along at the top here, you can move between the topics. And what we would love you to do as the discussion is going on is just pop any thoughts, suggestions, questions in here. And you do this by over on the left-hand side, go down to the 4th icon, which is a sticky note, click it, type in your question, press save, close it down, and you can move it to wherever you want it to be. It's as simple as that. So we're going to be using that as we go. So please do start to populate now, or as you listen to the findings of the research, and we'll come on to that in the discussion part later on. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Ruth. Sorry, I was getting distracted there by the wonderful food items that people are listing in the chat box. Oxford Sandy and Black. Someone has to tell me more about what this is. I will be Googling that. And whortleberries from North Devon. Never heard of those before. So, you know, you learn something new every day, which is fantastic. I'm going to press on with the agenda and welcome the first of our main speakers, James Woodward, my colleague from Sustain. He's going to be talking a bit about this Two Counties research that we've done. And James is the Sustainable Farming Officer in our organisation. James, do you want to come in?
Thank you, Ben. Yep, I'll just share my screen and get my slides up. Okay, so apologies if I start coughing or spluttering. I'm just coming to the end of a fairly nasty cold, so bear with me if I start coughing, but hopefully I'll be fine. So yeah, this work was done over part of last year and this year. Amber, on the slide there, she led on the research and she did a wonderful job with this work, and we jointly wrote the report up and everything like that. But yeah, it was a very interesting piece of work. As far as we could tell, it hadn't really been done before, so we were sort of going at it from scratch in a way, which I think was a really interesting and enlightening process, actually trying to essentially map local food supply chains, in particular local food infrastructure on a very local level. And we went with the level of a county, partly because there's some quite clear sort of administrative boundaries there, and we thought it would be quite good to go down to that level, but not to go down to a local authority level, because that would have been potentially too local in a way. So yeah, the purposes of the research really were to map existing local food infrastructure, try to understand what was already in the county, whether it was being used sort of within the frame of the local food system, or whether infrastructure that exists that wasn't being used in that way could be repurposed in any way. We also mapped the farm types as well on those two county levels. And we felt that was a really important thing to do for the third objective, which was to then try and start identifying gaps in infrastructure on a local level, trying to match what's existing, what farm types there are in the county, and therefore what gaps there might be that those farmers would, what gaps in infrastructure there might be that those farmers would need to be able to supply more locally. But we wanted to go kind of beyond the sort of hard mapping process, and we did want to try and use it to engage with local groups, local food partnerships, farmers, growers, local businesses that already exist, to start trying to identify any opportunities to fill those gaps, especially through investing in infrastructure, which I'll talk a little bit more as I go through. So for today, I'm going to use the example of Lancashire. So we mapped East Sussex, and we included the Brighton and Hove authority within East Sussex. I hope that's not controversial for anyone. And we also mapped Lancashire. And the purpose of that was to try and map two counties that had geographical differences, which had agricultural differences, and which had various sort of maybe economic differences as well. Interestingly, we actually found that Lancashire and East Sussex had quite a lot of similarities agriculturally. They're actually two relatively diverse agricultural counties. The methodology that we use, I just want to go through this first before I touch on any of the data, because I think this was a really important part of this work, was to try and create something that other local groups could take forward themselves to map their own area. And as I said, we were doing this from a very, very early kind of basis, not really a platform to build on. So we kind of started to work on this and build this ourselves. So initially, we kind of obviously did the planning and the scoping sort of stuff. And we decided the first thing to do was to look at any databases that might give us information. And actually, we worked with Adrian identifying some databases as well, which was a really good part of this project to work alongside the one that Adrian will talk about after me. So we found some databases with the Office for National Statistics, Defra and Companies House. We actually found that those databases were really lacking in terms of what they could tell us about local infrastructure, local agri-food infrastructure in those counties. Yeah, so they were very, very limited, which then started to kind of push us towards using other kind of methods, as it were. So we started using internet searches to try and find out more business information based on the databases. But we actually spent a lot more of our time doing more primary research with farmers and with existing food enterprises, essentially trying to find out what existed on the local level from their knowledge. And then we also started using that primary research and bringing in using other tools. So there's kind of existing mapping tools online that can tell you if there's any local mills in the area, any local sort of food hubs and that sort of thing. And again, that was really useful for kind of bringing together the primary research and providing a bit more of a basis for us. But of course, the whole primary research side of things takes ages, so we only managed to do a certain amount of it. But I think we did enough to be able to start identifying things a bit. And then we kind of did the evaluation and reflections thing. And in the actual report, we've set out the methodology in a lot more detail. So, if you're interested in doing some mapping yourselves on your local area, please do go and take a look at that report. And yeah, see if you can make it work in your local area. Okay, so some of the data that we found. So first, this is from the databases. So we did manage to find some decent data on the types of farming businesses in the area. So this was, we kind of broke this down into arable and horticulture farms on one graph and livestock and dairy farms on the other. And using Lancashire as an example, we managed to find out that there's quite a variety of farms growing vegetables, growing cereals in the area. Some growing other kind of non-perennial crops as well, and there's even some stone fruit growing as well in the area. Obviously, as we're probably all aware, Lancashire is quite a livestock-heavy county in many ways because it's due to its climate and that sort of thing. Excuse me. So yeah, so we found here that obviously lots of different types of livestock farms. Quite a few dairy farms as well. So essentially that allowed us to understand that there's quite a diverse type of agriculture in the county. So there's actually quite a lot of scope for investing in a local food system that could provide a lot of food on a local level. The other stuff we found in the database was around the types of businesses that have some sort of processing or manufacturing element to them related to food and drink. The data was very, very high level. It didn't really tell us what kind of infrastructure those businesses might have. It didn't even allow us to break down into individual businesses, but it did allow us to understand that there is some existing businesses in the county that is processing various different types of food. Even gave us some idea of employment as well, which was quite useful for understanding employment on a local level for a local food system. So yeah, as you can see from that, quite a diversity in the kinds of kind of processing and manufacturing of different food items in the county. So trying to kind of put those into some research outputs. So we found that there is existing infrastructure that could be repurposed, but we didn't feel like, and I'm sort of bringing in both East Sussex and Lancashire here, But I think in both counties, we felt like the existing infrastructure was maybe not quite diverse enough for a local food system, and not enough of it to create a food system on local level that could feed a lot of the population. And that some of those bits of infrastructure probably had limited capacity, as in they were probably already working at capacity in some way. So trying to add capacity onto those infrastructure was probably not going to be feasible in the near future. But at least it kind of could give a platform for those areas to build on. And we also found that there's a lot of interest from the conversations, the primary research, that there's a lot of farmers, there's a lot of existing food enterprises which are really keen to get investment in local food infrastructure and to catalyze collaboration between producers, between local supply chains, all the way down to the citizen as well. So there's a really strong case to be made from this as well, which was a really interesting thing we managed to get out of this this mapping work. Now, the types of infrastructure that we felt would be most useful in these counties, and it was quite similar across both counties with some slight differences. But food hubs in particular were seen as really lacking, but a really important gap in the infrastructure in both counties. And obviously a food hub could be based on different types of agriculture. So in Lancashire, it could facilitate a lot more livestock and some of those other cropping products. In somewhere like East Sussex, where you might have a lot more top fruit, for example, production, they can kind of be evolved into helping local farmers to fulfill what they need to do. There was an interest in food hubs. I mean, they might not be able to do all of these things, but things like maybe be able to process some of the food, certainly to be able to store food and distribute it. And there was this idea of a food hub and a distribution unit coming together in these local areas, and even some capacity to actually sell food as well. I think this is an obvious one. It's one that you hear quite a lot about, but there's a massive lack of local abattoirs in these areas. There is an abattoir in Lancashire, but it's a very kind of centralized big abattoir that's serving animals from across the north of England and even further. But it was felt that those kind of abattoirs don't really necessarily help local livestock farmers as such, especially smaller scale kind of agroecological ones. And then a lot of the primary research helps us identify that the kind of things around milk processing are really lacking as well. So farmers will have very limited storage on their farms, but they also won't necessarily have the processing to turn it into added value products like cheese or butter or cream. And there was a lot of farmers who were interested in the idea of vending machines. And there was actually quite a few interested in having like a vending machine location, which several farms could feed into as well, rather than each farm having an individual type of vending machine. And they felt that that would be a really good way of collaborating, reducing costs and that sort of thing. So this is kind of the the rough process we made. So obviously the top bit being that kind of mapping bit. And what we then wanted to do is follow up with that by trying to link the gaps that we identified in the mapping to the kind of the whole levelling up program and the themes within that, because there's got quite a lot of funding within that. Trying to do that with the local groups, and we ran some workshops in both East Sussex and Lancashire to do that. And obviously in the middle, bringing all the stakeholders around this as well. Excuse me. And then the third bit was working with those groups to try and find ways that they could engage with their local authorities around the investment plans that they're having to build around the whole levelling up kind of program. So we kind of really tried to focus in on the investment plans as part of this work as an added bit to the mapping, trying to make kind of local groups understand the investment plans and how they could kind of take that onto their local authority and build in, hopefully, investment into the local food system from the UK Share Prosperity Fund or the Levelling Up Fund, which I'll very briefly mention in a moment. But really trying to fulfill the different things that these investment plans had to have, and those are kind of the 4 key ones that we kind of engaged on. In particular, really kind of linking the infrastructure to measurable outcomes and interventions, which I think is really easy to do with local food systems, because as Ben was mentioning, there is evidence around things like jobs and local economy, and even there's some evidence linked to local climate and nature benefits and that sort of thing. So yeah, we did try to kind of link the mapping to levelling up. So we did it specifically around funding and trying to kind of identify funding opportunities. So one of those is obviously the UK Shared Prosperity Fund. There's money going into that each year for the next few years and potentially beyond. And then the other one was the Levelling Up Fund as well, kind of a sizable chunk of money over a 4-year period. And there's been some examples of the Levelling Up Fund investing in local food infrastructure. So some of you might have heard about I think it was 12 or 14 million pounds that was given to a project in Newhaven on the southern English coast to invest in a new fisheries hub there. And really keen to try and get more of those opportunities in these 2 local areas that we mapped, and obviously beyond as well into all local areas. And actually, really interestingly, the food partnership that we worked on in Lancashire with this, they ended up actually taking a levelling up bid to their local authority in Lancaster to get funding to set up a new food hub in Lancaster and a new CSA, community supported agricultural farm as well. So I think what was really nice about this mapping work is it's actually kind of led to some outputs beyond just the research as well. So just to quickly summarize, so obviously we found there's a lot of gaps in the data. It's not really usable to be able to map local food systems effectively. At least that's what we found, and obviously it'll be interesting to hear Adrian's experience with the data. And we found the primary research was really useful for painting more of a detailed picture, but obviously primary research takes a lot longer, so we didn't manage to do as much as we'd have liked, and hopefully we can maybe do some more on that. But yeah, the key kind of outputs we got from it was building at least the foundations of a methodology, and we'd like to build more on that. We managed to identify those really kind of a lack of local food infrastructure within those areas that's beneficial to local food systems. We managed to identify some very clear needs in infrastructure that would be able to start kind of building or rebuilding a local food system. And we managed to try to kind of link that to levelling up and try and catalyze hopefully some funding opportunities through kind of local groups using this work to engage with their local authority. And what we've done from this as well is kind of got a few recommendations. So one of the ones is we would really like to see much better data transparency and data available to be able to look into these things more. And the local food fund was something that came through our case for local food report, but really pushing for more kind of public investment in local food systems, both infrastructure and also local networks and partnerships to catalyze local food systems. If I was to kind of envisage where we'd go to next with this, if we were able to, for example, secure more funding or more interest in the work, I think it'd be great to build on the methodology, maybe in the existing counties, or to build on it just in general. It would be really interesting to maybe map some other counties, maybe a county in the eastern region, which is really arable dominated, for example, I think would be interesting. I think we should probably look at how we maybe engage with the Office for National Statistics and DEFRA around data needs, maybe. We will definitely continue engaging the Department for Levelling Up Housing and Communities on the opportunities of funding infrastructure on a local level. Yeah, and I suppose maybe do some more work around how we can make the methodology accessible to others so that they can kind of take it forward and do mapping in their own areas. But yeah, sorry for the coughing and all that sort of stuff, but I hope that's been really interesting. And I will stop there.
James, thank you for a fascinating presentation and also for heroic efforts. I know you've been off sick for the last few days, so thank you so much for battling through. I'd suggest you go and grab a glass of water very quickly because we're going to take some questions. I'm going to just firstly, as I said in the chat box, for those folks who might be struggling to listen, please do use the captions box. If you click on more at the bottom and choose the captions option, you'll be able to see a live transcript. Can't promise that it'll be fully accurate, but it should help. Also, I suppose, just to say, it'd be great to get some questions from you guys now. If you can go to the reactions button, raise, and you can have the option there to raise your hand. I think this is probably the best way we can do this. And I'm hoping that, because I can see a lot of you on the screen, that once you've clicked the raise hand button, you'll come to the top and I can bring you in. But before that, I've got a sort of question from the chat. At least I wanted to put it to James. This is from Chris Stopes. Just a question about whether the mapping identified or distinguished organic certified businesses in those local supply chains.
We didn't with this work purely because we were kind of feeling the ground as we were going along. I think what would be really good when I was talking about building on the methodology is maybe being able to do that a lot more. I think that would be really useful, both in terms of organic, maybe trying to identify if there's any sort of community supported agriculture farms in the area. Yeah, those sorts of things. It's not something we did with this mapping, but it's certainly something that we would be keen to kind of build into it in the future.
I suppose just building on that, I'd imagine in terms of data sets, as you said, is one of the issues. I would have thought the data sets for organic businesses are fairly accessible through OF&G and Soil Association.
I'd have thought so. I mean, having worked with Chris, with SOS and others, with Soil Association, it's always been quite easy to access that sort of data from them. But yeah, I think it's something that could be done. Yeah,
fantastic. So I'm looking for other questions. Other people raising their hands. We're going to have a chance for a lot of discussion later on, and also if you've got any questions for James that occur to you as we go through, then please do pop them in the chat. I'm sure James can keep an eye on those as well. There's a few people giving their thanks for a great presentation as well. Unless there are any other questions, and if I've missed anyone who does want to come in and I can't see you, then do unmute.
Ben, there was a comment about mapping. I don't know if you want to, sorry, not mapping, mobile abattoirs. I don't know if did that come up in the mapping, James?
It did, yes. So some of the farmers we spoke to really loved the idea of a mobile abattoir, but they were worried that it was maybe something that economically it's really hard for it to work economically, be viable economically. Some of them were really interested in the idea of having like abattoir hubs, so where it's kind of like a mobile abattoir. It moves to an area, it maybe services a group of farms in an area and then moves to the next one, and that might be a lot more economically viable. I know that the Sustainable Food Trust with Fur Farm have done some work around the mobile abattoirs, and they found it maybe is quite difficult to be economically viable. But yeah, it's a difficult one, I think. But the idea of this sort of the abattoir hubs was something those livestock farmers were interested in.
Thank you, James. Thank you, Vicky, for flagging that. I'd like to bring in Dr. Adrian Morley now. Dr. Adrian is a interdisciplinary social scientist specialising in sustainable food systems and food policy at Manchester Metropolitan University. Adrian's going to be talking about the research that the Soil Association and MMU have done and some of the recommendations that came out of that. Adrian, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Ben. Yeah, I'll just share my screen, hopefully. Right, that's kind of at the beginning. Okay, yeah, thank you, Ben, and thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for giving me an opportunity to talk about this research. As has been mentioned, so that this work was done by Manchester Metropolitan University in partnership with the Soil Association and through funding from the Aurora Trust. It was done roughly concurrently with the work that Sustain did that James just outlined. But the main 2 points of difference, I guess, between our work, between the two pieces of work, was this piece of work really focused at the regional level, so regional food systems rather than local level food systems. And then also related to that, the focus was very much on what's termed the public plate, so public procurement, and the relationship and the potential relationship between local food production and supplying schools and hospitals and canteens, etc. So I'll just run through the main points from the report now, and then perhaps we can talk maybe a bit more about the commonalities between the research and the issues around data mapping later when we have a discussion. So then just briefly to go through the sort of formal aims and objectives, that the aim was to understand the capability of farmers and other food producers to supply schools, hospitals, and other public sector caterers through regional supply infrastructure. And that was broken down into three interrelated objectives. First of all, to identify the extent of regional food processing and distribution infrastructure, and map 3 regions as a way to understand that extent, to understand the nature of regional food and processing and infrastructure. Second objective was to have a look at the long-term trends in food processing and supply, and see if there are any critical trends, whether it's decrease in numbers of particular types of production or increases in things that can be taken advantage or harnessed from a policy perspective. And then thirdly was linking regional food supply with the nature of public procurement. So we looked for strategic opportunities to develop regional food supply, but also to help develop the sort of social benefits and economic benefits of the public procurement system in the UK. So that's kind of a symbiotic relationship between the two sectors. Just briefly, the research process then. So we, like the Sustain work, we began by looking at existing regional food data that's published by the ONS and collected from various sources of government. We also looked at the information that's available through public procurement contract notices and tried to marry the two. We conducted a survey of public procurement organizations last summer to try and understand the nature of the existing activity and these barriers and opportunities as mentioned. We also ran we consulted with stakeholders, so we did a series of interviews with various representatives from the system, regional supply and public procurement, and then worked towards identifying some key challenges, opportunities, and then made some policy-oriented recommendations. So just briefly, a bit of context then. The underlying focus, I think, of this work was in terms of understanding the system was trying to make the case for the regional food processing as an economic power, so as a provider of jobs and a provider of services for producers and services for purchasers, particularly public sector purchasers. So food manufacturing is actually the largest manufacturing sector in the UK, even though it's very rarely the focus of political discourse or even discourse within the sustainable food agenda. We tend to focus, for understandable reasons, on farming and consumers, but this is the bit in the middle that's actually, as I said, very economically significant and socioeconomically significant. It goes without saying that food also, is also a vital element for health and well-being in this country, public health and planetary health. And again, the food processing element of it is a key cog in that relationship. And as I mentioned, yeah, it's something that's overlooked, particularly with the policy focus of this work. We make the argument in the report that this is an area that's been overlooked by policymakers at a national level. It's slightly different at the regional level and with the devolved nations. Okay, so just again a little bit of background there, and I apologize for the colors of this, but distinguishing between the colors, but food manufacturing accounts for 25% of the entire gross value added of the UK food system. So it's broadly on a par with retailers, so a similar economic impact as, you know, the multiple retailers, and it's second only to catering, and that includes public sector catering, but also obviously restaurants and fast foods and all the other different aspects of catering. It contributes about 29 billion pounds to the UK economy every year, and that's, as you can see in these statistics, over around 2.5 times the economic contribution to from agriculture and fisheries. Conceptually, then, this is the kind of system, or this is a way of understanding the food procurement system. So the public food procurement system. So we have on the left, I'm not sure if I can use pointers on here, can I now? But so on the left, we have a large body of regional food producers in the UK and also overseas. And on the right, we have a large body of consumers in the public sector, mainly pupils, patients, and workers to a lesser extent. And what you can see structurally is that there are a smaller number of vital intermediaries between these relationships. So there's a very small number of public procurement organizations relative to the number of producers and consumers, I mean. And there is also a small number of processing and supply infrastructure businesses. So we're looking at the relationship between those two elements in the middle with the aim of contributing or improving the beneficial relationship between the producers and consumers, essentially. A bit more background then. I think this figure here is taken from the UK Food Security Report from last year, just to emphasize that we are really quite blessed in this country in terms of our agricultural output and our ability, at least in theory, to provide the amount of food that we consume as a nation. So you can see here many of the key subsectors, you know, a high proportion of food that's produced is consumed within the country, so it stays within the UK. The key exceptions to this, as you can see on the table here, is fruit and vegetables. So fruit in particular, we only 16% of what we consume in the UK is produced here, and vegetables around half. So in the UK Food Security Report last year, they calculated that approximately 76% of what can be grown on a commercial basis in the UK is currently grown here. So looking at this data, it looks like a fairly effective food system in terms of buying and the UK being self-sufficient. But obviously the devil's in the detail in these kind of figures. So the first stage then, for the research process, we looked at trying to understand the nature of public sector food demand in the UK. So what we did is we did an analysis of contract award notices that have been published over the past, well, between 2018 and 2022. So public sector organizations are obliged to be open and transparent when they're undergoing contracting processes, and this information is available. So we had a look at where awards have been placed and what kind of businesses are supplying the public sector in the UK at a national level. So this analysis involved looking at 226 contracts, doing digging into each one, and we found that, or within the 226, there were 461 individual contracts that were let within this time frame on the board. Rather positively, I guess, depending on your perspective, the 67% of all the contracts were let to regional SMEs, and a further 15% to large businesses within the region of the contracting authority. So together, around 78% of contracts are currently held with businesses in the region. So on the surface, this looks like positive development. Procurers are able to say that we're sourcing from local businesses and therefore supporting our local economies in that respect. Similarly, the 74% of total contracts went to SMEs, whether that's regionally or nationally based, again, which is a good news story. We took this data, and there's further analysis in the report for those that are interested. The food sourcing survey that we ran over the summer involved asking procurers questions about their use of regional food and contracting arrangements. And we found a similar percentage, so 82% in the survey compared to 78% from the notice analysis. 82% of contracts are held by regional suppliers in across the UK. And this was estimated by the people that responded to the survey to account for 90% of the food spend, of their food spend on average. So there was some variation in that, but when we averaged it out, it was about 90% of those that responded. When we came, however, to ask where the food that is sourced by the suppliers is sourced from, so in other words, the ultimate origin of the products themselves, the estimate was actually only about 31% on average of the food spend. So by this, what I mean is that although the contracts are held with regional suppliers, those regional suppliers don't necessarily source their ingredients and produce from the region that they're held. So in fact, if we're looking at how the public sector can support regional food economies, this figure of 31% is more relevant as a level of food that comes in from regional sources. The most common types of regional supply arrangements, according to the survey, was milk and dairy products, followed by meat and bread. They were the three ones that were most likely to be held by regional businesses. Okay, so the next process then was to try and take this understanding of what demand looks like from the public sector and map it to the information we have about supply at the regional level. So using the analysis from the procurement notices, we developed this table here, which is an indication of different categories of businesses that would typically supply through these public sector contracting. And this is a very a general framework that we found quite a lot of variation within the kind of contracting arrangements, but typically there were between 3 and 4 on average main contract types. So what we call first tier suppliers, and then we mapped through probable producers, the second tier suppliers that would typically supply these suppliers. So the key word here is typical. This is a representation of public procurement demand. So we took that, using that as a way to understand the nature of regional food demand by the public sector. We looked at data held by the ONS through the Interdepartmental Business Register and tried to tried to analyze what the extent, the nature and the type of businesses within the regions of the regions of England and then Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. I'm not sure why Northern Ireland is not on this figure, but this figure really illustrates the fact that food processing and food production, so that the columns with a kind of reddy brown on the left are primary producers and green on the right are manufacturers and other types of intermediaries. We can see from this map that UK food production and processing is quite heterogeneity. There's a high degree of heterogeneity across the UK. So within, if you look at it at a regional level, there are businesses across all the main categories identified in the previous slide that have the potential to supply the food procurement demand. So in a way, again, this is a positive finding in terms of that there are businesses that exist in each at the regional level with that potential. Of course, with this data, we don't know whether they're able or interested or willing to supply, but we can see that there are numbers within each sector. Using the same data, we had a look at longer term trends. So this is over the past 10 years, or rather between 2011 2021, to try and understand whether there are some elements of public sector demands produce that are growing and some that are suffering and losing in terms of numbers of businesses. So again, we got primary production on the left and the processing sector on the right, and you can see that in many categories, the numbers of businesses at least have been growing over the past 10 years, but there are some key ones that stand out, notably vegetable growing, and that the palm and stone fruits would be apples, pears, as well as plums, that kind of thing, and dairy farmers as well. The numbers of dairy farmers have fallen away over the past 10 years. But you look on the processing side, there, one that sticks out here for me anyway is the number of processed food manufacturers has risen by 200% over the past 10 years. So this is a clear direction of travel for the food sector and the food manufacturing sector. So we looked at 3 regions to help us try and understand regional food supply and public sector demand a bit better. We looked at Northern Ireland, the devolved administration Northern Ireland, southwest of England, and Greater Manchester. These were chosen because they are quite different from each other and would hopefully illustrate various a wider range of aspects that we can consider in our analysis. So looking at the numbers of businesses under each of the sectors within each of the region, we found by and large that there are numerous businesses that could potentially serve the public sector at the regional level. There were some exceptions to this, which this slide illustrates. So going from the bottom upwards, unsurprisingly, Greater Manchester being predominantly urban based, there's a lack of fruits and different types of fruits. Also a lack of food processing and preserving of potatoes, pig rearers. In the southwest of England, interestingly, we found a similar lack of number of processing and preserving of potatoes, and also poultry meat producers. So this is a way of really identifying, again, at a regional and a strategic level, whether there are any potential blocks in the system that you could perhaps apply some funding or some regional strategic action to broaden the supply base at the regional level. It should just say one of the stumbling blocks for doing this kind of work was that the data from the ONS had to be was only provided rounded up or down to the nearest 5. So it's because of the ONS have a duty not to provide information that can help you identify individual businesses. They guard against us by providing this level of information. So you'll see that the numbers in brackets on the right, this is where we have gone and done some legwork to try and understand who the 5 business, whether there are really 5 businesses or 0 businesses or something in between. So we predominantly used a database called FAME, which is a private company that collects information about different types of food, different types of businesses, and food being one of them. So this is another piece of the regional analysis. So what we did, of course, just, having information about the numbers of businesses can only get you so far. It's only helpful to a certain degree. But without information about the nature of the output and the volume of their output, it's very difficult to make any clear conclusions, for each particular region. So one way to help us provide a bit more detail was that we looked at the number of businesses in relation to the population in each of the areas. So this table here shows the numbers of residents within each of the region per business. So this is a way of analysis, again, to identify whether there's certain types of businesses particularly underrepresented or overrepresented at the UK level. So green on this table corresponds to being overrepresented in terms of the UK average, and red represents being underrepresented. So you can see, again, unsurprisingly, Greater Manchester has fewer primary producers, and and then there are some other interesting points that, again, could be addressed from a policy perspective. So then just moving on to the challenges and opportunities, and I'll just go through these fairly quickly. These were based on the discussions with the stakeholders that we consulted with, again, mainly over the summer. And there were some key headlines to this element of the research, many of which I'm sure will resonate with people in this workshop. So we found that the complexity of procurement demands compared to other types of demand from the commercial sector, and again, a relative lack of transparency when trying to deal with public sector procurers, is a barrier for many producers themselves, that they find the level of information required, or finding out people who they should speak to, is so difficult that they don't pursue these opportunities. And this is something that is recognized by people who have done work or been active in this area. There was a definite feeling that public procurement can be an attractive alternative route to market for many regional food businesses who have found themselves increasingly, once you operate at certain volumes and in relatively low margin sectors, the market pushes you towards relying on key retail customers typically, and public procurement is a important potential alternative to that, to help them broaden their supply or their customer base. Matching the scale of demand with available supply was a key challenge brought up by procurers, both through the survey and through the interviews. So there's a perception, rightly or wrongly, that local and regional producers can't provide the level of demand that's required for public procurement, and that's what stops these relationships developing. And then of course, cost and pricing is vitally important in the public sector. It's predominantly a high volume, low margin market, and that's just the realities in which schools and hospital catering services operate. Not necessarily low quality. It has a lot of qualities to the food that's provided, but if we're thinking about the unit cost and the margins that suppliers get, it's not something that is necessarily beneficial for small producers and small food providers. And then just briefly then, so commercial fruit and vegetable, commercial fruit and vegetables are available all year round, but the supply does not align with public sector demand. And also many of the domestic food and vegetable producers that operate at a certain scale supply multiple retailers who tend to make a bigger thing of it being UK produce. So a lot of the production that's happening is already going to multiple retailers as opposed to into the public sector catering system. The use of appropriate purchasing structures can definitely facilitate regional supply, and this relates to the dynamic food procurement model that was mentioned earlier. So anything that simplifies the processes for producers and provides flexibility was seen as a positive. Regional producers state that there's a wide range of support measures in order to help sort of a wholesale shift towards supplying the public sector, and a key one with that is to provide as much of a guarantee as, or not guarantee, or assurance of stable and predictable demand that would allow these commercial businesses to make the required investment, having confidence that they would be able to supply. Contracts will arise, or supply arrangements rather will arise at the end of it. And then the final area was just around the government buying standards, which were out for consultation during this period. And the proposal by the UK government was to oblige public procurers to purchase at least 50% of food from local or environmentally enhanced producers. And we'll wait to see whether that actually comes out, whether this is within the published set of procurement buying standards, but at least that was what was consulted on, and that was seen as challenging but broadly welcomed, I think, by everybody that we spoke to for this research. I appreciate I've gone over my time a bit too much. So just we set up a series of recommendations. A lot of focus on the horticultural supports of fresh produce sector, which if we're going to really see a step change in regional food supply, this is an area that requires a lot of attention, and should benefit from opportunities that there are around post EU policy reforms. So movement away from the common agricultural policy and new ways of supporting the food system. So that would be sort of the key takeaway message, I think, would be a focus on horticulture. Yeah, and then I think related to the theme of our workshop today, within the government food strategy that was published in the summer, there was a commitment to develop a food data transparency partnership, which is a process that ultimately aims to encourage or even mandate food businesses to publish information about various things related to animal welfare, environmental impact, socioeconomic impact. And this report is trying to make the argument that this is a policy vehicle that really has enormous potential to open up our understanding of regional supply, public sector demand, and how you can bridge the two aspects of it. And that was it. I just wanted to end on this very brief slide. This is from the new Covent Garden market. It just illustrates the seasonality within the UK. So there's a common refrain as though we don't produce food all year round, and we could never supply fresh produce if we wanted to. But as this chart illustrates, there is a range of fruit and vegetables that are available year round. I think the key is or one of the aspects of it, apart from developing the production capacity, is to look at what schools and hospitals are demanding, and that relates to menus and working on consumers' preferences around food. So if we change our menus towards these kind of vegetables at those times of the year, we can have a lot of benefit in connecting those two. Yeah, so apologies for going on a bit a bit long on that. There's a lot more detail in the report, and please get in contact directly if you have any questions.
Many thanks, Adrian, for a really fascinating presentation. I'm going to jump in with a quick question of my own before we take other questions. You talked about the government's target within public procurement. Do you think that actually public procurement is ready to adapt to that target of 50% local or sustainable? And do you think something like dynamic procurement could help with that local supply element of it?
Yeah, I think the devil will be in the detail in terms of how the demand for so how local food is defined and how higher environmental standards are defined. So certainly there will be a lot of issues around infrastructure, and if one of the conditions is that food must stay within the locality, so can't go out for processing or for distribution, there could be some potential or major potential blocks there. And of course, the economic reality is that a lot of, not all, but a lot of local and regional food costs more. I think DEFRA estimated that meat was 20% higher and vegetables was 10% higher or something like that. But there's definitely a cost premium. And, it goes without saying that for school meals providers and hospital food providers, the cost is king, so there's that element to it. So I think it would be a long-term process, and there are things that need to go alongside it, things that can benefit local and regional food as a whole, not just supplying the public sector. So things around infrastructure and marketing and bringing producers together. Yeah.
I was going to say the chat box has been on fire during your presentation,
okay,
so there's a fair amount to plow back through there. I've picked out a few questions, and actually a good intervention from Laura Chan around how one does make local and sustainable food more affordable in the public sector, particularly by doing locally and seasonal designed menus. I'm just going to pick up on a few questions. I know we're running a little bit over, but I think it'd be good to respond to some of those. I'm going to start with actually a question from Laura Chan. Was land or land use suitability a consideration in scoping opportunities in regions, e.g. soil type?
Yeah, it was. We didn't include that within the remit. It was considered, but we focused mainly on the processing and supply infrastructure rather than the primary production capabilities. But it is definitely it's relevant. When even at the regional level.
Fab.
So that would be a good next stage.
I'm just going to fly through a few more questions. I was going to say, if people want to raise their hand, I will bring you in. But for some of the other ones that have come through in the chat box, so a question here from Holly Whitelaw. Have you any ideas on the average school and hospital meal spend per child or patient?
There may be some procurers on the call that might have a better idea than myself. It's not information that I think around 80p a portion per pupil or patient per day, but I think it varies a lot, and from other bits of research that I've been involved in and I've read, but I couldn't tell you what the average is at the moment.
That's absolutely. I'm sure, as you said, there'll be other people on the call, hopefully, who can come in on that, some of their Food for Life colleagues. A question here from Lopez Saxena, just saying, in terms of the challenges and opportunities, was there an appetite for considering healthy and sustainable food by the key stakeholders in public procurement?
Yes, and so the procurers would. I'd say that the main overlying message from procurers could be sort of categorized as they were able to procure the food that's demanded of them. So if the menus and caterers are asking for healthy and seasonal vegetables, they can provide that. The procurement function is really about bringing supply and demand together. And there are, of course, nutritional standards and healthy eating standards that are applied across the public sector that have an impact on the types of food that are provided or sourced through procurement systems.
Thank you. And just a quick note from Patricia Wallace, because this was something that was raised during the presentation, just asking it'd be good to get the statistics for Northern Ireland for the chart, where I think it sort of fell off the end, and notes that social farms and gardens have just carried out a report for Belfast City Council on their food policy framework and action plan. Did you, I'm going to miss this, Adrian, did you tell us a date for when this is going to be launched, released to the public?
The report is ready and it will go out to the participants. Ruth is going to share a copy of the report, so yeah, everybody should have access to the detail.
And will it also be put online? Just thinking if we want to sort of share it with other people. I can see Ruth nodding.
Yeah,
fantastic, thank you. I'm just going to raise a couple more questions before we move on. There was a question from Rose Lewis earlier. I think it was aimed more at you, Adrian, but James, I appreciate there's been a few questions for you that have come in since Adrian was presenting for you, so do feel free to jump in on this as well. Do you think that agriculture and fishing are such a small part of the value? And I think this was, Adrian, relating to your gross value added slide, because they're not paid a fair price. And is there a way of redoing the pie chart to reflect true cost accounting to show what it could be worth?
Yeah, I mean, this is a perennial dilemma, really. That obviously one of the big issues we're facing is around affordability for consumers, as well as a decent wage and livelihood for producers, and finding that balance between making food affordable and providing income is a very extremely tricky situation, particularly when governments are relying on market forces rather than intervening directly. Generally speaking, the less intermediaries they are, the more scope there is to provide those margins to filter through to producers. So, a move towards shorter supply chains, producers working together to distribute, for example, rather than employing other or working with other commercial distributors. There's those kind of methods to bring it through. In terms of true cost accounting, I mean, that's again would be a great piece of work if at a regional level, we would require a level of data that we'd have to generate it ourselves, but it's certainly something I think that would resonate in policy circles. Yeah.
Fantastic, thank you. We are running out of time for this section, so I think it's time for us to move on. Huge thank you, Adrian and James, for your presentations, and I'm hoping that you will both chip in. Actually, I should just want to say one last thing. James, were there any questions that came in that you wanted to respond to over the mic, or do you feel like you've managed to answer them adequately in the chat?
I think I've answered them okay in the chat. I'm just trying to remember now. Sorry. No, I think it's okay. If anybody wants to kind of bring the question back in, I'd be more than happy to go over it again.
Fantastic, thank you. So we're now going to be moving on to the next section, which is a bit more workshopy, a bit more interactive. Ruth has shared a link to the Jamboard, which I think hopefully should be able to share again, just so everyone's got that link front and center. And hoping that everyone can click on that link. It's not something that you need to do a login to, so I'm pretty confident everyone should be able to access this. And what we're going to do, I can see a few of you guys have posted in ideas and thoughts into some of these different slides. We've got 5 different slides. So 5 different questions that we're going to be going through, and it'd be really great if people are able to sort of put up post-it notes with some of your responses to those different points. I'm going to read out a few as we go, but I'd happily get people to chip in and to unmute and talk through the points that you're making as well. So if you follow that link, I'm hoping we'll see lots of people busily responding on these different slides. We have, I'll just talk through what we've got and then we'll go through them one at a time. So first up, we're going to be talking about what is needed, some practical next steps. Then talking about how do we make the case for more investment in local food infrastructure, how we overcome the data gap challenge, and what are the opportunities to influence policy, and then how could different groups and organisations and networks get involved. I think we've got a few, yeah, I think there's been a couple of slides accidentally added on the end, but those are the 5 different areas. So my understanding is in terms of the way this works, you go to the sticky note option on the left-hand side, take a sticky note, or you click on that, you write in it, and then it should answer. So I'm just going to do a quick test to check that works. And it goes up there, yeah. So, so I'm just going to read out some of those points on the first slide around what is needed. So we've got funding for pilot test areas to link up suppliers and procurers. Did whoever put that want to come in and speak more to that point? I think that might have been you, Ruth.
Sorry, too many tabs open, trying to stumble around, trying to find the unmute button there. Yes, that was me. Yes, I was just thinking about how helpful it is when we have kind of real life examples and case studies. It links back to the point I made in the introduction about sort of showing the art of the possible, actually proving that this works and having some data and impact statistics behind it. And so I thought, yeah, what felt like an obvious next step was to do some piloting in some of the regions or local areas. And I'd popped a question in the chat actually about SFP networks. Obviously, Sustainable Food Places is a programme that we run along with Sustain and Food Matters, and got 80+ local areas now with active food partnerships. I'm thinking there must be examples within there of how within those food partnerships we've done this kind of connecting and joining up suppliers and buyers. But beyond that, obviously all of this requires funding, costs money. It feels like if we could amass a bit of a database of case studies and show what works, that could be really helpful in making the case for sort of nationwide support. So I suppose it's a couple of things in there. It's funding to do more pilot and testing, but also surfacing the data that we've got. And so where we are actually already doing this on the ground, surfacing that up and sharing it and making it available to all who are working in this space.
Thank you, Ruth. I was looking through the attendees to see, I think there might be a couple of people who are staying quiet who are part of local food partnerships, but I'd welcome them to unmute and chip in with their experiences locally. I should also say, with my sort of historic involvement in Sustainable Food Places, that I know that this is going to be a bit more of a focus for next year, looking at, we do an annual campaign, and I know there's going to be a much bigger focus on the good food economy locally, so hopefully more opportunities to be supporting places doing this and really sort of highlighting those folks who are already doing that. So maybe just picking up on a couple of the other points that have been raised here. So how do we raise the profile of this issue in local authorities and get councillors and staff interested? If anybody wants to speak to that point, please do unmute and come in. Otherwise, I'll read a couple of the other ones out. So in terms of what's needed, existing food logistics infrastructure such as wholesalers, catering, butchers should be used rather than setting up new food hubs. Profitability is challenging for the latter. I think this is a really interesting point. There's a lot of interest in this concept of food hubs, and I think some of the folks in the chat have rightly sort of asked what exactly is a food hub, and it's a term that an umbrella term for many different types of operation. It is, I suppose, useful, and also I think it does need that sort of extra detail when we're talking about sort of solutions. So I think that's a really good point. How best to argue for investment in local food system infrastructure? What framing would help with local and central governments? I think this sort of picks up a little bit on a point in the chat that Courtney raised around, Courtney Scott Dawson raised around what is the language that's most convincing, and using that parallel with the Health Foundation research that was saying actually using an economic lens may not be the most convincing thing when it comes to certainly trying to justify action on health, and a question over whether that's the same when it comes to local food systems. Courtney, you're welcome to sort of come in and I suppose explore that point a bit more. And James, I think this was something you also responded to. So either of you, please do unmute, because I think it speaks to this point in that's been raised here.
Yeah, I think hi everybody. Hi Ben, hi James. It's always me that's talking about framing. If it's a framing question, you can assume it's me. But I think I was just reflecting on how investment, like we need investment, and it goes hand in hand with a cost-based argument, and how that's important to know what the cost is and how much investment we need. People are going to ask that, but how do we get beyond that into really speaking to hearts and minds about the kind of values that underpin why this change is necessary? And I think someone, I think, forget your name, was it Adam from Scottish Food and Drink, messaged me to talk about to say that the Danish around organics also shows some of how that kind of framing work can happen, especially around linking to other policies and other benefits, co-benefits of investing in a particular sector. So I think that's something that's worth exploring a bit more off the back of this research that you've done, is how to translate that beyond an economic frame going forward.
Thank you, Courtney. Actually, that leads us on really well to the next slide. So moving us on to how do we make the case for more investment in local food infrastructure? We see that sort of framing aspect is one part of it. So just picking out a couple of the points that have been raised and added on the tabs. So someone was saying showing what's possible through research like this and specific focal points for investment. I think that's really important. Getting data on economics to mayors and MPs, etc. I think that's something I would be really excited about. We Sustain once did I call it a calculator, where we were putting forward a tool. This was as part of the campaign for a soft drinks industry levy, and we put in the data. This was various different data sets that came from University of Liverpool and others, and processed through into you basically tapped your postcode in, and it showed you what impact that would have in your local constituency or local authority in terms of the various health benefits. So theoretically, one could do the same with the right data sets to say what the economic benefits would be for your local area. You'd need to get some pretty decent data sets in order to do that, but hopefully that would be something like that could be a really powerful way and an easy way for individuals to be able to communicate what the economic benefits would be, potentially other benefits that could be from these sorts of supply chains, and communicate that to their local authority, to their MPs, to try to justify more investment, more support in this sector. So that's a good suggestion. Just reading out a couple more here. So understanding what local authorities want to deliver and link clearly to those objectives. I think that's a really good suggestion. I think that maybe comes back to Ruth's point around, particularly where you've got things like local food partnerships, with whom there should be representation of local authorities, making sure that we are speaking their language in order to make sure that there is that support. And that support could be anything around planning, it could be signage, it could be making sure that local food investment is on the shared prosperity fund agenda. So for those who don't know, and do jump in if I've got the wrong end of the stick here, but my understanding is every local area gets a chunk of shared prosperity fund money, and is for those local authorities to decide on how it is spent. Now, how do we make sure that local food in general is at the top of those council agendas? Well, again, this is where I think having those food partnerships, making sure that there are ways in which food is on those local authority agendas is really, really crucial. So I think that's a really good point. Does anybody else want to jump in and speak to any of the other points that have been raised on this second slide? Please be my guest. Otherwise, for the sake of time, I say we're going to move on to the next slide. The next slide is looking a little bit bare, so maybe I'll stick on this slide for now. Please do add in your thoughts on how we can overcome the data gap challenge, but I'll just read out a couple more in terms of how we make the case for more investment in local food infrastructure. So someone else here was saying use the local media to showcase local producers, and why not going into local schools, etc., and ideally into local shops, or why it isn't going into local schools. This is a really interesting point, actually. In some of the research that my colleague Sophia and other colleagues at Sustainable Food Places did recently with particularly with enterprises involved in the Sustainable Food Places network, we're showing in terms of what are their needs, what support do they need, and particularly in the context of a cost of everything crisis. And one of the big things that came through is actually buy local campaigns. And I think for those of us who've been involved in this world for many years, I think there's a bit of a sort of Marmite sense around the buy local campaigns. You need them, but there's also a question around how effective they are, and where do they signpost people to? Do they end up with directing people towards just buying lots of local jam or locally made artisan chocolate, which, you know, there's benefits to that, but it's maybe it's a slightly different aim and a different output to buying local agroecological weekly groceries of meat and dairy and veg and fruit. So you know, how do we make sure that people actually, how do you promote local in a way that challenges people's habits to buy locally regularly, rather than just buying sort of niche sort of presence, if you will, and how do you use the local media in terms of promoting that buy local message? I'm going to bring Vicky in, as you have your hand up, Vicky.
Sorry, yes, I'm trying to undo all the clicks. Hi. Yeah, I was just going to bring in the issue of wholesalers versus hubs versus whole new thing, which is clearly a big issue. And one producer quite rightly has said in the chat, it's very difficult to have the surety of a demand. You need a sort of regular and predictable demand if you're a producer, and that's a difficult thing. And then on the flip side of that, we want buyers to be more flexible to accommodate the agroecological changes that farmers are going to have to do in order to maintain sort of climate ready farming and nature-based farming, etc. So the diversification, maybe change specifications so they're less demanding of sort of cosmetic perfection and things like that. So there's loads of things that need to be talked about, and it seems to me most sense to be talking about that ideally at a local or regional level, doing that matchmaking function, so you can actually look people in the eye and have that relational kind of discussion rather than purely transactional based on money, and that's very difficult, and it's hard to see that really. It will help if we had procurement standards from the government and buying standards that were really much better. And we've talked about that a bit, and that's a clear focus for our lobbying. But a regional, local level, you know, it feels so much better for that to be local networks talking about what's possible, or talking about what's not possible, but also talking about, you know, we've got to have these kind of prices. So sort of that matchmaking process, which people have pointed to, seems to be really critical. And if we can encourage local authorities and other players locally to do that, that seems to me the relational rather than transactional purely kind of approach to work, I think. Just one thought.
Thanks, Vicky. And it's just as you said that, Caroline Burgess posted in the chat about the important role of wholesale as well, and a link to a Scottish article. So for those of you who have now turned all your attention to the Jamboard, also do keep an eye on the chat, because there are some interesting links being posted there. So many screens, how do we cope? Cool. So I'm going to move us on from this point around making the case to the next slide, the next discussion point around how we all overcome the data gap challenge. And I should also say at this point, Ruth and the team at Soil Association have the unenviable task of writing this all up. So some of those points that have been posted that I haven't missed, don't worry, they will be captured. And like I said, if there are points that you think are getting missed, I'm not mentioning, then do unmute and jump in. We're a friendly bunch, we won't bite. So moving on to how do we all overcome the data gap challenge. yeah, I suppose just different ways we can interpret this. You know, what national data sets are there actually available out there? You know, where could the link to those be shared? We've heard from James about the ONS, the DEFRA data, Companies House data. We were talking earlier about the data that Soil Association and OF&G have on organic businesses. Is it about having a central hub that links to these? We're slightly wary of those sorts of solutions, but if they get well used, then maybe that's it. Maybe there's something like that, or some of the, in terms of databases of finding local producers, things like Big Barn exist. It's not necessarily going to be relevant to public procurement, but from a consumer point of view, there are these sorts of sources. So just reading out some of the suggestions that people have added into the slide. Yeah, exactly that point. Making the data we do have available. I know, James, did you want to jump in on this, or indeed, Adrian? You know, you've both have gone through tons and tons of data, and you highlighted some of those shortcomings that were out there. Do you think, is there a shareable methodology from your work that other people could pick up to save time in terms of going right to the root of some of this data? So I suppose this point of what already exists and how do we make that better available, we can move on to a second about where the gaps are.
So we had to essentially request the data from the Office for National Statistics, etc. I mean, the methodology we set out names specific databases that we used from them. So it would hopefully make the methodology easier for other people to apply to their area. But I think a lot of it's a case of, having to request databases, and it's not necessarily something that we could make available ourselves. But I mean, there's a really good project called the Food Data Collaboration, who are doing a piece of project, is doing a piece of work to look at how you can create a commons approach to data in terms of local food systems, so that lots of different online platforms like the Open Food Network, who are leading the project with other partners, can kind of pull data into one place and have a more kind of commons approach to data, which would really help, I think, in terms of building local food systems. But in terms of accessing data already there, I mean, interested to hear Adrian's thoughts, but the data was very high level, and it wasn't particularly useful in some ways, but also just wasn't really there, hard to access those sorts of things.
Adrian, did you want to come in? And also, you mentioned in your presentation about some of those government food strategy aims to have more data transparency. Do you think there is anything within that might actually meet some of the needs of what we've been talking about today around local and regional supply, or is it more about the supermarket supply chains, for example?
Yeah, well, first of all, I would echo the experience of James in terms of the data and the utility of the data that's available from the ONS and other governmental sources. I think when you look at it at the regional level, the complexity is so high that there's a usefulness in the kind of approach that we took to identify some potential bottlenecks in terms of closed loop, supply systems, and then go on the ground and speak to businesses and suppliers. So it can help orientate you, within the region and within the complexity of the food production system within each region. But beyond that, the level of information that's available is so abstract that it's, you can't avoid having to go boots on the ground, and talk to people. So it can help orientate people who want to do work in this area. I think the food data partnership was announcement. There's not much detail, as you can imagine, because the food strategy, the government food strategy, UK government food strategy itself was a fairly short document that lacked specifics. So we will see, and we can hopefully hope to influence what this partnership will look like. Certainly, there was intent expressed in the food strategy for it to include procurers as in terms of having to report certain levels of data. I think if the data, you know, stretches across, as I said, things like animal welfare, environmental impact, sourcing, that kind of thing. If that data was, you know, mandated and available to researchers and, you know, organizations like Sustainable Storage Association and local food partnerships, it would have an enormous potential really to inform us all about, you know, what is there within our regions and what is the impact of sourcing locally compared to sourcing regionally, buying organic, you know, where you put your money. But we just don't have that level of information at the moment about what the food data partnership will look like, unfortunately.
Oh, Ben, you're on mute, I'm afraid.
Thank you. I thought I'd unmuted. I must have redone it. Thank you, Adrian. So just reading out a couple more posts that have been noted in the slides. So for data to be useful to act upon, we need context and changes over time. So food mapping and gap analysis can provide us with that baseline data that we can build upon. Quite right. We need to have better discussions about what we want to measure and why, then who is best placed to do this, and then who and where this is collated. I think this is really crucial. I think there has been, and there's got a few links in the chat boxes to mapping and data collection that has been done over the years. So who owns that data, who is owning it, and who is collecting it, I think is really crucial. Who's going to be doing something about it rather than it sitting on a shelf. You know, time and resources are limited, so making sure that we are clear on what already exists so that we're not repeating it, and really identify the gaps and identify those questions and things that are going to be useful for us. And one of the things that I don't think has really come up is looking at, and I don't know if anybody can help on this front, but looking at consumer data. So if you are a business setting up, where might you locate where you know there's going to be a market for your produce? This is something that, my understanding, supermarkets live and breathe this sort of level of data, and yet I imagine that's something that's very expensive and hard to get hold of for the majority of enterprises we're talking about. So, you know, where might that data exist? What role might we as a group have, or somebody have, in trying to make that more accessible to the sorts of great enterprises that we are trying to support? I'm going to move on to some of the other points, but whoever raised that question about for data to be useful to act upon, needing context and change over time, please do unmute and come in, because if you have any answers for that, I think we'd all love to hear. Just looking at some of the other points here, so citizen science approach to cover the whole of the UK and get more granularity. I think this maybe speaks to that point around who owns that data, who is collecting it, and a citizen science approach certainly being one of the ways you can do that. Other forms of data and evidence, not just numbers. I think this also speaks back to Courtney's point around how one frames it. Economic data is one way of convincing people that they need to do something, but powerful personal testimonials. And that was something I was really struck by reading, James, the report you did with Amber, about some of those quotes that you used from farmers, from wholesalers, really moving in terms of why this is so important. I think it's good to put faces in this. This is one of the joys of local food. It's about developing that personal relationship, about understanding where that carrot has come from, how it's been grown. And I think those stories are one of the things that certainly a number of people I've spoken to working this over the years, does they tell a good story, because the produce is often more expensive. It's hard to get hold of. So people really need a different way of valuing this. Vicky, did you want to come in?
Just a quick note just on the citizen science. I'm sorry, I just remembered that many years ago when I was working at Friends of the Earth, and we have Friends of the Earth has hundreds of local groups around the country, and we asked them to go into the supermarkets, and this was particularly looking at retail, but supermarkets, and look at how many local apples and how many sort of global apples were on the shelves, and do some analysis of that. And they're brilliant local groups. They did a great work, and it got a huge amount of coverage and pressure at local level. This was many years ago, so there's a lot to overcome to change things, but it was really powerful sort of citizens like project. So that can work very well, and people just had to do it in one day with a sheet and do some recording. It's really exciting. I just wanted to reflect that and save you from having to talk all the time, Ben, as well. So please do put your hand up if anybody wants to speak.
Quite right, Vicky. And I should say you've been working in this field for many, many years. Your expertise on this is hugely valuable. So I think one of these things is, what can we learn from all the work that's been done on this over the years, rather than, I'm not going to say reinventing the wheel. I think there is a time and place for things. So an idea that might not have worked 10 years ago now might be the right time for it. So, but I think certainly learning from that is really important. I'm just going to read out a couple more points on the data gap challenge before we move on. So do have a look at the next slide, start putting notes on it. But someone was saying a clearer definition of what local food means. I'm gonna say, have a look at the case for local food report. There's a definition there. Let's use that as a starting point and then and move on. But it's a good point, but equally, I've been in meetings for years where we've gone around in circles about how to define local food. It needs to be done, but we also need to support it in its many forms. Also, where to share useful data, ideas, please. I think this is really crucial. I think we need to answer this. So certainly I'm going to take away as a point from this to talk to James, Vicky, and certainly anyone else on this call about how we can best share where that data that already exists and pull that together in a place that's accessible. As a first instance, I would say sign up to the newsletter for Sustainable Food Places and have a look on the website there. I think that would be a good place to be linking to some of this. It's probably not the only place. So moving on to what are the opportunities to influence policy? This is an area that I think I'd really like to bring in, particularly James and Vicky and Ruth, Adrian, any of the speakers today. If you've got any initial feelings on this, you may have well have put them in as notes, but it certainly gives me a time to read through the notes that other people have posted.
I'm happy to come in on one. I think, yeah, I mean, there is the whole levelling up policy agenda, and there's money through that. So I think that's definitely one policy opportunity to be trying to influence as much as possible, trying to get money through local authorities or money where MPs have an influence from levelling up. I would definitely say, I think what Courtney was saying earlier around framing is really important in this regard, because I mean, certainly we met with lots of MPs and councillors in both East Sussex and Lancashire as part of that kind of follow on from the mapping. And we definitely found that the whole kind of levelling up themes around pride in place and that sort of thing were important to what kind of funding bids MPs and councillors would be interested in. And I'd certainly say that kind of that whole pride in place thing is perfect for food, because people have pride in local food. They have pride in their local food system. So I would certainly say, yeah, that's a really key policy kind of opportunity to be influencing. I'll hand over to Ruth.
Thanks, James. Yeah, I think also another crucial opportunity really lies in the dynamic for food procurement approach. As I mentioned at the beginning, we're part of the National Advisory Board along with others on this call, and we really do need that sort of local and national government support for its rollout, which sort of got out of the starting blocks and then didn't quite, and it's now being sort of implemented, sort of in pockets, and fantastic, work is happening in terms of opening up local supply for, SMEs, but yeah, just the commitment at a national level to support its rollout is really, really needed. So that's definitely something that we are working on.
Thank you, Ruth. Actually, just to pick up on a point that was shared in the chat box by Genevieve around the link, the latest from the NFU. So that call for public sector organisations to buy 50% of their food locally, that's actually also reflected in the government food strategy, and it's something that I think a number of organisations like ourselves, many on this call, who responded to the consultation about those public procurement standards, I think were supportive of certainly 50% being local or sustainable. And I think there's some detail there on how that might break down, how it might work in practice. It's all in the right direction. I think the challenge will now be, are the government actually going to do anything about this? Despite it being one of Rishi's election priorities as leader of the Conservative Party, we have recently heard that any response to the consultation is now being kicked back into autumn next year. If there is anybody, particularly anybody from DEFRA on this call, I think there are a few people from DEFRA, if they want to contradict me on that and say that that response is going to be coming out sooner, please jump in. Would happily be stand corrected on that. Adrian, you wanted to come in on this question of what are the opportunities to influence policy?
Yeah, it was just a couple of things. So I just wanted to mention the fact that the Data Transparency Partnership will be consulted upon, and the aim was to have something in place early 2023. So I think, you know, workshops like this, and if we can all go away and think about this issue, that could be an opportunity just through, you know, a volume of submissions and really, you know, make the case for the broader understanding and of the range of benefits that data can provide for this kind of agenda. So, you know, the more people that can respond to that, the better. I just wanted to also just very briefly mention this issue of framing. And I think the reality is that we need to be prepared to frame this in different ways according to the stakeholders and the policy levers that we're trying to influence. And one of the, I think, a key type of stakeholder that tends to get overlooked is in this kind of agenda is the role of private investors and business people wanting to invest money into a market that they see as growing, you know, and we could perhaps do a better job, you know, and I know I focused on the economics of it in my presentation, and that's not to say that I'm not concerned about all the environmental sides of things, but I think if we can make a case for investment from commercial investors, you know, whether it's individual entrepreneurs or, you know, investment banks or whatever, you know, whatever level, that, you know, there's a role there that could be played, you know, in a system where there's very little public finances around. I'd also say that the source of funding over the years tends to vary according to other issues that come and go. So, for example, a lot of food work was funded through public health over recent years because there's been funds available there. At the moment, it may be around economic development through levelling up, and it might be something else further down the line. So we need to be literate across a range of policy areas and therefore able to frame the argument in different ways. That was just a point.
Thank you, Adrian. I realise we have but 12 minutes left, so I'm going to just read out a couple more of the points from the slide influencing policy, and then we'll move on to the final slide, and then we will need to be wrapping up. But just to flag some of the questions that come through on how do we influence policy? Well, what are the local policy levers as well as national? A very good point. I know this is something that was addressed in the Case for Local Food report and in certainly in the Tale of Two Counties report as well. Just giving them both another plug. Also getting information to the Shadow Chancellor of the Exchequer as part of Labour Party Green New Deal. You know, from a sustained point of view, we are talking to various people in the Labour Party about trying to get a number of different food solutions and food policy issues onto their agenda. There is a good question: are we talking to the right people? So hopefully that message will get through, and equally as much to all the other parties as well. There's a couple of other questions on here or ideas around land use framework discussions in Lords and Parliament could be a jumping off place, e.g. making land available so local infrastructure can be invested in. I certainly, we are hoping that next year we will have more discussions on a land use framework, so that indeed that could be a good opportunity. I'm going to move us on now to the final slide. So how could different groups, organisations and networks get involved? I've been doing far too much talking, so if there is anybody that wants to unmute and speak to any of the points they've raised here, please be my guest. otherwise I will kick off by reading out a couple of these. Link up with organic initiatives. Definitely agreed. I think that's something that's come through very strongly here. And I know there's been some discussion in the chat about organic versus regenerative versus local. I think there is room for all of this. The problem is we are all fighting for a tiny percent of the market. So we need to be working together to increase all of those different things. They're not mutually exclusive. Abattoirs are being lost in the UK, meaning that this is now an animal welfare issue. Stock travel hours equals stress. Local or mobile could resolve this for many. Big barriers to overcome the first. It strikes me that I would personally be really interested in seeing more around what modelling has been and what piloting has been done around mobile abattoirs. So please do post in the chat anybody who has examples where this has been piloted. I know Sustainable Food Trust have done a lot of work with the abattoirs group around trying to rescue the sorry situation we have with abattoirs at the moment, and I've heard a lot of mentions of mobile abattoirs as being a potential solution. So yeah, how much money do we need to fund a mobile abattoir in one of these different areas? There's money out there. I think we need to start driving this and start piloting it and start showing the evidence that there is about the benefits they could be for those. So I think that's a really valuable point. Thank you for who raised that. Sustainable Food places members to undertake local mapping of opportunities and facilitate connections. Agreed. I think that is definitely an area. Coming back to the point earlier around making sure we're clear on what data is going to be useful and that there is capacity in those partnerships to actually drive forward some of that work. Some of those partnerships are fantastic, well established and decently resourced. Others, including some on this call, it's a group of volunteers, very well-meaning volunteers who do unbelievable work on zero. So I think we should also be realistic about how much we can achieve. But let's make the case for those guys to get funding to do that. Does anybody else want to jump in on any of the other points that are raised here in terms of how different groups and organisations and networks could get involved? Ruth, I know you raised this point earlier around reflecting from Sustainable Food places. Is there anything that did you have any sort of answers to your own question, if you will?
Yeah, I think I just generally the sort of concept of networks is something that at Soil Association we're really interested in, and I'm in particular in the context of this area of work really keen on thinking about how we can keep this network going, and sort of we've talked about sharing data and different sort of opportunities for that. We've talked about sort of different groups linking up within this group, but just I suppose the idea that we're all working towards the same goals here, and that idea of sort of collective partnership and collaboration. I'm just really keen to explore ideas around what a network looks like, and we're exploring sort of digital infrastructure that might support that. So just welcome kind of thoughts and interest really, if people want to sort of keep this group alive, or a similar group to just keep the dialogue open when it comes to sort of case studies, data collection, ideas, policy alignment, across a breadth of areas of work. I just think it's really important, and it's something we're very keen on.
Fantastic, thank you, Ruth. There's a point that's come up in the chat and a related point in the box. Louisa, I was wondering if you might want to unmute and come in. You were sort of saying about a big issue here is a lack of horticultural experience as it's all gone from farming. We need new training infrastructure. And you're saying there is work being done on this at a national level. I'd love to hear more about this. I think there's also a post-it note around interesting to see how this might all link with local workforce development. Of course, that might be someone else's point entirely, but I'd love to hear, Louise, what work is being done on this at a national level.
Yeah, hi. We're farmers, and we're traditional farmers, and we're trying to make the change from traditional farming to more regenerative practices, and it's like trying to turn the Titanic. And where we are in rural Wales, you've got CSAs doing organic work, and then you've got traditional farming, and there's a huge gulf in between. And the local people, the local farming fraternity, have all grown up in a non-organic mindset. And as I say, if we want to start growing vegetables, which we did 2 years ago organically, there's nobody locally who's got the expertise to do that. And we're trying to bring in people from England and elsewhere to help bring in that expertise. But then we've got a problem with local accommodation, being coastal and house prices are sky high. No one can afford to live here. And for planning reasons, we can't use static caravans, etc., etc. So basically, I've got hundreds of customers who would buy my produce, but I have nobody who will help me grow it. So that is a huge problem. So I think it's mapping and all the rest of it's great, but at the end of the day, we need people who can actually do the growing on the ground. And we've been talking to Ivy Cymru, who I believe are also, who is Grow Wales, who I think at a national level are looking at this, how we can bring back apprenticeships around growing organically, because there just isn't the skill set. There's lots of people who are very enthusiastic, but if you say to somebody, right, run a market garden and feed 300, 400 people, there's nobody who's got the experience to do that in broad terms. I hope that helps.
Thank you, Louisa. And I missed the name of the organisation. You said we're doing something at this at a sort of Wales-wide level.
Grow Wales.
Grow Wales. No, it'd be great if you are able to find a link and post it in the chat box. I think a lot of people would love to follow up on that and that example. And I think, as you said, a real lack of training and a need for training and skills. I think that's echoed through a lot of our work. I can see Vicky typing busily, because I think that's something she definitely agree with. And this issue around housing for workers as well. We're talking about collaboration with different networks and organisations. Is this time for us to be working with some of the housing organisations around rules on second homes and holiday homes? I don't know, maybe slightly outside the food space, but it's all related. On which note, I'm going to hand over to Ruth. We're going to be wrapping up now. Thank you so much for everyone's input into the discussion. Ruth, I know you wanted to come in with some reflections on some of the next steps, what we're going to be doing next.
Fantastic. Thank you, Ben. And thank you, everybody, so much for all of the contribution and discussion today. It's been absolutely brilliant. The next steps in terms of sort of practical next steps from here with regard to this research and the discussion today is, as mentioned, both reports will be shared to all of the attendees. We will be doing a write-up of the discussion points, capturing the Jamboard content and questions in the chat. That will be communicated as soon as we've had a chance to do that as well. And we will also we'll be publishing content on our website in the form of blogs and web content relating to this. So there'll be lots more to come and lots of opportunities, hopefully, to connect and keep the conversation alive. On a soil association front, as I mentioned at the beginning of the session, public procurement's a big focus for us, and we remain committed to this on both our programmatic fronts, so that's through Food for Life served here predominantly, but also in our policy work, and big sort of priorities for us in the next few months are to continue our work along with other NGOs on this group, working with DEFRA on the government buying standards, and so we'll be continuing on that front, our sort of lobbying and work there, but then also thinking about Food for Life served here, and in particular the sort of the local elements of that scheme and what that's enabled, continuing to grow that programme and growing our sort of bespoke consultancy that we offer alongside that, in terms of working with specific local authorities to help them to source more locally, change menus, etc. So yeah, a big area of focus for us on going into the new year. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ruth. So this is the point where I start to say about what Sustain's going to do next. But I just wanted to before I go into that, this virtual room is full of practitioners and experts, living and delivering this day in, day out. So can you post in the chat box what you are looking to do next? And we've had some great posts along these lines already, and I've probably been lost, but I just wanted to flag them. So Adam Forrest saying that he's looking into making small and medium abattoirs economical for ScotGov and Scotland Food and Drink, particularly for organic producers. So appreciate any thoughts and ideas on how to tackle this and feed into the conversation. Adam@foodanddrink.scot. So Adam, do post your email again. I'm sure people would love to follow up with you, and then a similar post, well, not similar, a related post, and I missed the name of who posted this annoyingly, from work in Scotland on the Food for Life programme around blockages in the supply chains for Scottish chicken and lack of vegetable processing. How do we break these down? So whoever posted that, I apologise.
Lucy Wardle.
Lucy. Thank you, Lucy. Please, yeah, Lucy, put your email in the. Yeah, thank you. Put your email in the chat box, and hopefully folks can email you and with ideas on how to break that down or to follow up on that. And Tilly Jarvis from the SOS UK, which is a students organising for sustainability. Who are looking into pilots and work around the universities which have farmers on their land in order to explore barriers and solutions to universities buying from those. So if anybody is interested in working with then please let Tilly know. Tilly, please give us your email address. And if Tilly is not here anymore, please let me know, because I have Tilly's email address somewhere. But yeah, if people are interested in helping that. So yeah, anyone else who's got any requests for help, ideas that you've got, good ideas that could spread, please post those in the chat. From a Sustain point of view, as you've been hearing today, we've identified some common needs through some of the work that we've done in the 2 counties, the Case for Local Food, the work that Vicky and James did surveying farmers. So from our point of view, it's really clear there is a need for a local food retail growth plan. That's something that we are recruiting for somebody to lead on. We think there's a need for a local food investment fund, something that potentially could be carved out as a part of the UK Shared Prosperity Fund, or indeed other funding sources are available. There's a need for better promotion, a need for honest labelling. We need for supportive policies, including small business support and cementing the grocery code adjudicator, which was at risk. It certainly could do better, but it's getting rid of it altogether is not the solution. And political engagement to achieve all of this. As someone said earlier, locally, we need some local policies and local solutions. And from our point of view, we want to be engaging with local councils to ensure that there is investment in local food infrastructure as part of their plans for the UK Shared Prosperity Fund. We want to see how planning can better support agroecology and local supply and not be undermined by unsustainable alternatives. And also we want to be working with the Sustainable Food Places Network, as I said earlier, about exploring our annual campaign for next year, how a focus on a good food economy could support local food infrastructure. And needless to say, in the next month, many of us will be at the Oxford Rural Farming Conference, whether in person or online. So hopefully we can pick up some of those conversations there. Sustain are going to be doing a session on food and farming policies from across the 4 nations. My colleague James is going to be organising that, which we hope will be covering some of these issues, so touching upon them again. Bridging the Gap, my colleague Sarah will be organising that along with Hannah Gibbs, who was here earlier. We'll be organising that at the Oxford Rural Farming Conference. So, and also, if any of you present are doing anything on supply chains at the Oxford Rural Farming Conference, please post in the chat box, and we will see you there. So just to wrap up, thank you again to the Aurora Trust for funding this work. Thank you, Hughes. Thank you to the research and contributors today, Ruth Galpine, Dr. Adrian Morley, James Woodward, and Amber Laws, who co-wrote the report with James, and Vicky Hurd as well for all your input. And thank you to all the contributors as well today. It's been a fantastic discussion. So much going on in the chat, so much going on the Jamboards. It's been slightly hard to cope. So yes, huge thank you to Ruth and co, who are going to be writing this up and following up. I'm going to end with a quote. I'm also going to suggest that we keep this open for a little bit longer. Don't worry, I won't be talking anymore. I'll be turning my video off. But because there's so much stuff going on in the chat, I hope we don't want to lose that, so people can be busily following up on that over the next few minutes. Like I said, I'll leave you with one of the quotes. This was from one of the market gardeners that was responded and involved in the 2 counties research. In the end, it's all about strength in numbers and a diversity of localized routes to market, which creates a resilient business. I think that is very true. Thank you very much for all attending and all being part of this today, and hope to see many of you in Oxford and beyond in the new year. Thank you.
Thanks, Ben.
Thank you so much, Ben.
Bye, everyone.
Bye. Goodbye.
Everybody.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Vicky, do you want to stop the recording?
Yeah, that's a good point.